Today, if you find yourself in Chicago, at North Lakeshore Drive, number 1350, you will see only faceless concrete high-rises, typical of any modern metropolis. The wind from Lake Michigan beats against the glass facades, cars race by, and nothing, absolutely nothing in this landscape hints that it was precisely here, on this very ground, that a structure stood which contemporaries called nothing less than the eighth wonder of the New World. This was not just a rich man's residence, it was a manifesto carved in stone. And, like any great empire, it vanished, leaving behind only the phantom pain of lost grandeur. But why did history choose to forget this palace? People whispered about this place as the castle. Imagine a massive stone fortress in the style of early Norman Gothic, as if teleported straight from medieval Europe into the mud and chaos of the American Midwest at the end of the 19th century. This house did not try to be welcoming. It was intimidating. It had one detail that stunned passers-by and caused competitors to tremble far more than the tall towers or crenellated walls. The massive oak entrance doors had no handles. There were no keyholes, knockers, or bells on the outside. Smooth, impregnable wood. One could enter this house for only one reason: if the one inside decided to let you in himself, giving a signal to the servant to open the door from within. This was a symbol of absolute, almost frightening power and total control. Who was the architect of this fortress of alienation? History often paints portraits of American magnates of that time as loud, ruthless predators, like John Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan. But the man who created this castle was woven from paradoxes. His name was Potter Palmer. And if you think you know the typical story of American success, you are deeply mistaken. Palmer was not the heir to an old empire, nor was he a rootless adventurer. He was born into a Quaker family in the state of New York, in silence and strict morality, where luxury was considered a sin, a loud voice a sign of bad manners, and modesty the only virtue. How did it happen that a boy raised in the religion of radical simplicity built the most ostentatious, most expensive, and most extravagant mansion in the history of the Midwest? The answer to this question lies not in banal greed. It lies in fear, and in love, which was stronger than this fear. Potter Palmer arrived in Chicago in 852, when the city was a dirty, chaotic cluster of wooden shacks where sidewalks literally sank into the slush and the air smelled of slaughterhouses. He was 26 years old. He had no influential patrons, but he had a mind that worked like a cold, precise scalpel. It was this quiet Quaker who accomplished a revolution whose fruits we use every day without even suspecting the author. It was Potter Palmer who first, in the history of trade, introduced the concept of the possibility of returning a purchase. Imagine a world where, having bought something, you were stuck with it forever, regardless of its quality. Palmer, however, said, "If you don't like it, I'll give you your money back." This sounded like madness to merchants of that time, like a sure path to ruin. But this risk made him not just rich, it made him the king of retail. He understood people's psychology better than they understood themselves. By the age of 40, he owned entire streets. He rebuilt the city center, turning State Street from a narrow alley into the main shopping artery. It seemed he had reached the peak where one could settle down and rest on one's laurels. But no one knew that inside this successful, calm strategist, a plan was maturing that would make the city elite twirl a finger at their temples and predict his downfall. He was about to do something that contradicted all common sense and economic logic. He looked north of the center, at the wild, sandy dunes and swamps swarming with insects, a place that locals contemptuously called the Frog Pond, and saw there what no one else saw. Instead of building his house on prestigious Prairie Avenue, where all the respectable millionaires of that time lived, Palmer decided to go into exile on the swamps. He was preparing to challenge both nature itself and high society at the same time. And this audacity would become the beginning of both his greatest triumph and his inevitable, tragic oblivion. We stand on the threshold of a story about how eternity is built, and how frighteningly easily it turns into dust under the treads of time's bulldozers. But to understand how this castle fell, we need to return to the origins of that worldview that made Potter Palmer erect these walls. To understand how a man decides to build a castle on a swamp, one must first understand what clay he was molded from. Potter Palmer was not like the stereotypical robber baron of that era. If other Chicago magnates who made their fortunes on railroads or the meat industry were loud, crude, and physically imposing, Palmer remained a ghost. His Quaker upbringing in the state of New York laid in him a foundation that many mistakenly took for weakness. Quakers believe in the inner light and value silence. Palmer learned to listen when others shouted and to observe when others acted blindly. This was his superpower, the ability to stand motionless in the center of chaos and see the structure where others saw only disorder. When he arrived in Chicago in 852, trade was a battlefield, literally. Buying fabric or a dress turned into an exhausting duel between seller and buyer. There were no price tags. The price depended on how well you could haggle. It was a system built on mutual distrust. The seller tried to deceive the buyer by palming off shoddy goods, and the buyer tried to ruin the seller by driving the price to the minimum. Palmer looked at this theater of the absurd and decided to change the rules of the game, guided not only by morality, but also by cold calculation. He opened a haberdashery store, which became a laboratory of the future. Palmer introduced what then seemed like commercial suicide, a system of fixed prices, no haggling. The price written on the tag was final. But he went further. He introduced a policy that today seems normal to us, but in the mid-19th century sounded like a revolution. If you didn't like the goods, you could return them and get your money back. Competitors laughed, predicting that cunning buyers would ruin him in a week. But Palmer understood human psychology deeper than anyone else. He knew that the fear of making a mistake was the main obstacle to purchase. By removing the risk, he opened the floodgates of trust. His target audience became women. At that time, women in stores were treated disdainfully as second-rate economic agents. Palmer, however, created a sanctuary for them. He made his store a place where they were respected, where they were trusted. And the women of Chicago responded with loyalty that converted into gold. By the start of the Civil War in 1861, Potter Palmer was no longer just a wealthy merchant. He was a visionary. And here, the second trait of his character manifested: the ability to go all in when everyone else retreated. Foreshadowing the inevitability of the war between North and South, Palmer realized that cotton supplies from southern plantations would cease and textile prices would skyrocket. While others panicked and hoarded cash, he bought up all the cotton and wool reserves he could reach, filling the warehouses to the brim. When the war began, his prediction came true with frightening accuracy. Prices rose several times over. Palmer sold his reserves and made a fortune that allowed him to move from the League of Merchants to the League of Empire Builders. Now he had the money, but he needed space for maneuver. Chicago of that time was cramped. The trade center was located on Lake Street, a narrow, dark street by the river. Palmer looked at the neighboring State Street which was then a backwater alley with dilapidated shacks, and declared, "Here will be the new center of the world." This was his first experience in redrawing the city map. He began buying up real estate on State Street, but ran into a problem. The street was too narrow for his ambitions. What did Palmer do? He didn't ask for permission from the authorities. He simply negotiated with the building owners and physically pushed the house facades back, widening the street at his own expense. By the end of the 1860s, Potter Palmer owned nearly a mile of real estate on the city's main street. He built there the first Palmer House, a hotel that was meant to be a gift to the city. He was at the peak of his power. He was rich, respected, and influential. But in this equation of success, one variable was missing. Potter Palmer was a lonely king in a golden cage. He was over 40, immersed in numbers and strategies, but he lacked a voice that could transmit his greatness into eternity. He needed a partner who could turn his money into culture and his buildings into a legacy. And fate was already preparing a meeting for him that would change not only his life, but the very structure of American high society. He did not yet know that everything he had built on State Street, his hotel, his stores, his empire, would soon disappear in fire in one night. But this very catastrophe would become the catalyst for the appearance of that very castle, which he would erect as a monument to his unbreakable will. However, before the walls fall, a meeting of two worlds must take place. The world of old money and the world of new ambitions were preparing for a collision in the person of one young girl. In 1870, a variable appeared in the equation of Potter Palmer's life that changed everything. Her name was Bertha Matilda Honoré. She was 21 years old. He was 44. This 23-year age difference caused whispers in Chicago's drawing rooms, but those who saw them together fell silent. This was not a typical misalliance of a rich old man and a young beauty. It was a merger of two superpowers. If Potter was the engine, Bertha became the rudder. The daughter of a wealthy businessman from Kentucky, she possessed what no amount of money could buy: innate aristocracy, impeccable taste, and a steel will hidden under a corset of French silk. Their marriage became the first strategic step toward creating a legend. As a wedding gift, Potter, in his style of absolute extravagance, built her the Palmer House Hotel. It was the most luxurious building in the city, a symbol of their union. But fate loves cruel irony. The hotel opened its doors on September 26, 1871. Exactly 13 days later, on October 8th, the Great Chicago Fire began. That night, Potter and Bertha lost everything. The fire, devouring the city at hurricane speed, destroyed 32 buildings owned by Palmer. His empire, built over decades of labor, turned into a heap of smoldering bricks and melted iron. The wedding gift, the hotel that was meant to stand for centuries, crumbled to ashes without having operated even 2 weeks. Potter Palmer, the man who never gave up, was broken. Standing on the ashes, he told his wife that he was tired. They had enough personal funds left to go to New York or Europe and live there in carefree luxury until the end of their days. And it was precisely at that moment that Bertha Honoré Palmer revealed her true essence. She looked at her husband and firmly said, "Mr. Palmer, it is the duty of every Chicago resident to stay here and rebuild this city anew." This phrase was worth more than all his lost millions. She did not allow him to become a fugitive. Inspired by her determination, Potter made the riskiest financial maneuver in the history of 19th century American business. He went to the Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company and took out a personal loan for $1,700,000. This was the largest private loan ever issued to one person at that time. He put at stake not just his name, but his very existence. They rebuilt State Street. The new Palmer House became even more majestic than the previous one. But now, with the business saved, it was time to think about a home. And here, Potter Palmer made his boldest strategic move, which forever divided Chicago society. In those years, the entire city elite, the Marshall Field, Pullman, Armour families, lived on the South Side, on Prairie Avenue. It was a safe, respectable enclave of old money. Living anywhere else was considered social suicide. But Palmer felt cramped within the framework of others' rules. He looked north, along the shore of Lake Michigan. There was nothing there except sandy dunes, wild thickets, and swampy terrain that local residents contemptuously called the Frog Pond. The land there cost pennies because it was considered unsuitable for construction. Palmer saw in this chaos a blank canvas.
In 1882, he began buying up these lands, acre by acre. People twirled a finger at their temples. Palmer has gone mad. Who would go live on a swamp? He did not just want to build a house. He wanted to create his own world, where he and Bertha would be king and queen, away from the judgmental gazes of neighbors from Prairie Avenue. He hired architects Henry Ives Cobb and Charles Sumner Frost with one task: to build something that would never burn. The memory of the fire of '71 haunted him. He needed not an Italian-style villa or a French chateau. He needed a fortress. Thus was born the project that would become known as the Castle. The construction budget grew in geometric progression. Starting from $90,000, the estimate quickly exceeded $1 million. These were astronomical sums of money. For comparison, a skilled worker of that time earned about $500 a year. Palmer was spending on his house the budget of a small state. He brought granite from Wisconsin, sandstone from Ohio. Every stone laid in the foundation of this house on the swamp was a challenge to society. It was as if he were saying, "I will make you come to me. I will make the city turn north." And he was right. But no one, not even Bertha, could imagine what this stone monster would look like inside. Construction began, and the shore of Lake Michigan trembled from the driven piles, heralding the birth of a new era. The era of the Gold Coast, grown from the stubbornness of one man. By 1885, the scaffolding was removed, and Chicago froze in amazement. Against the backdrop of the gray waves of Lake Michigan rose not just a house, but an architectural anomaly. It was a castle of brown sandstone and granite, as if carved from a rock. But if the exterior facade was a hymn to masculine power and paranoia, with its crenellated walls, massive towers, and loopholes, then the interior was an entirely different story. It was the psychological projection of its creators' souls, embodied in matter. Passing through those very handleless doors, a guest entered another world. The first thing that knocked you off your feet was the silence. The massive stone walls cut off the howl of the wind from the lake and the noise of the city, creating a vacuum that demanded reverence. You found yourself in the central hall, which rose to the height of 3 stories. This was the heart of the house, a vast octagonal space crowned with a glass dome through which soft, diffused light poured. In the center stood a fireplace of such size that whole logs could be burned in it without sawing them. The floor was laid with Florentine mosaic, every piece of which had been brought from Italy. But the real magic began when you started moving through the rooms. This house was a labyrinth of 42 rooms, and each of them was a separate universe. There was no single style here. It was eclecticism taken to the absolute. Potter Palmer allowed Bertha to create an encyclopedia of luxury. Take a few steps from the hall, and you enter the Louis XVI drawing room. Everything here screamed France. Gilded stucco, silk wallpaper the color of champagne, furniture upholstered in velvet on which it was terrifying to sit. But go further, and you find yourself in the Moorish room, intended for smoking and men's conversations. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and perfumed oils. The walls were covered in intricate Eastern carving. The carpets were so thick that footsteps sank into them soundlessly. This was a stark contrast, from feminine French lightness to dark, masculine Eastern mystery. Another door, and you are in the Spanish music room. But the house's greatest treasure, its soul and nerve center, was the picture gallery. This was a room 75 feet long, larger than many homes of ordinary Americans. The walls here were covered in red velvet, creating a backdrop for the golden frames. And it was precisely here that the main drama of taste unfolded. While other millionaires bought up boring academic painters or old masters to prove their respectability, Bertha Palmer filled this gallery with works that were considered scandalous at the time. On the walls hung canvases by Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Edgar Degas. The bright, blurred spots of Impressionism strangely contrasted with the heavy Gothic architecture of the building itself. This was a visual conflict, a fortress house built by a conservative Quaker, inside which lived a revolutionary art collection gathered by his progressive wife. The gallery was so vast that Bertha often used it as a ballroom, where hundreds of couples swirled to the music of an orchestra, reflecting in mirrors brought from Venice. But behind all this aesthetics hid advanced engineering. The house was a living organism. It was one of the first private residences in Chicago to be fully electrified. Incandescent lamps, still a novelty at the time, burned in crystal chandeliers, creating an effect that guests described as caught sunlight. And of course, the elevator. The first private passenger elevator in the city, allowing ascent to the tower without effort. Bertha's bedroom was the apotheosis of her status. Her Rococo-style bed stood on a dais like a throne. The bathtub was carved from a single piece of marble and weighed more than a ton. Every morning, waking up in this room, she saw the endless horizon of Lake Michigan. However, strolling through these halls, it was impossible to shake off the feeling of coldness. This house was not created for cozy family evenings with cocoa. It was created for receiving kings, presidents, and ambassadors. It was a stage. Potter Palmer, having spent more than $1 million on construction and furnishings, created the perfect setting for his wife. He himself often preferred to spend time in his library, the only place where the spirit of his Quaker restraint was preserved, among books and accounting reports. The house became a magnet. As Potter had predicted, the elite could not resist. Soon the swamp around the castle disappeared. Neighbors who had laughed at the Palmers began buying up land nearby to be closer to this center of attraction. Thus was born the Gold Coast. But while music thundered in the ballroom and champagne flowed like a river, in the shadows of these 42 rooms, a quiet tragedy was already beginning to emerge, which neither the thick walls nor the handleless doors could prevent. For even the strongest castle cannot protect against time and the change of eras. By 1893, the Palmers' castle reached its zenith, becoming the unofficial royal palace of the United States. Chicago was hosting the World's Columbian Exposition, an event meant to show the world that the city had risen from the ashes.
And while millions of tourists wandered through the White City of Jackson Park, the real power was concentrated in Bertha Palmer's drawing room. It was precisely here, among Renoir's canvases and velvet drapes, that the fates of cultural diplomacy were decided. But behind this facade of absolute triumph hid a deep human drama and growing moral dissonance. In this moment in the Palmers' life, a paradox manifested that often haunts great dynasties. The higher they rose, the thinner the air around them became. Potter Palmer was already 67 years old. He increasingly remained in the shadow of his brilliant wife.
If Bertha was the sun around which all social life revolved, Potter was turning into the silent gravity, holding this system from falling apart. The drama lay in the fact that precisely in the year of their greatest triumph, 1893, the American economy plunged into an abyss. The financial panic began. Banks burst one after another, railroad companies declared default, and on the streets of Chicago, just a few miles from the luxurious castle, lines grew for free soup. And here we see a frightening moral ambivalence. While Bertha received the Spanish Infanta Eulalia and hosted receptions whose cost could have fed an entire working-class neighborhood for a year, behind the walls of their fortress, class hatred was growing. Palmer, being a Quaker, always believed in honest labor and justice, but he built a wall that separated him from reality. He saw numbers, but stopped seeing people. His castle with handleless doors now worked not so much for entry as for protection from the outside world. Were they heroes who gave the city beauty and jobs, or cynical barons feasting during the plague? A viewer of that era could not give an unequivocal answer. But the main fracture occurred within the family. Bertha, appointed chairman of the board of lady managers of the exposition, effectively became the most influential woman in America. She fought for women's rights, for their recognition in art and labor. This was a noble goal, but the irony of fate was that her own ambitions began to eclipse the man who gave her this platform. Potter Palmer, the architect of their wealth, was slowly fading. His health, undermined by decades of stress and titanic work, began to fail. A strange dynamic appeared in their relationship. Potter wrote a will that shocked lawyers with its simplicity and absolute trust. In a world where men controlled every cent and left their wives only a modest allowance under the supervision of trustees, Palmer was preparing to give Bertha everything. Without conditions, without reservations. This was an act of love, but also an act of recognition. He understood that the pupil had surpassed the teacher. He saw in her a strength that he, perhaps, no longer had. By the end of the 1890s, the castle began to resemble a golden cage for its creator. Potter increasingly rarely left the library. He heard the music coming from the ballroom, heard the laughter of guests, the clink of glasses, but it was a party at which he felt superfluous. He had built this house to assert himself, but the house swallowed his individuality, turning him into a mere husband of Mrs. Palmer. On May 4th, 1902, Potter Palmer's heart stopped. He died in his room, in the fortress he had built on the swamp. His death became a turning point. It would seem that with the departure of the patriarch, the empire should have faltered. But it was precisely here, at her husband's coffin, that Bertha Palmer faced a crisis that would either destroy her or elevate her to unattainable heights. The will was opened. The estate was valued at $8 million, and the entire city held its breath. Could the Queen of Social Soirees hold real power in her hands when the protective walls built by her husband were left without their guardian? History was preparing a test for her that would turn the widow into a legend.
but the price of this transformation would prove fatal for the castle itself. Potter Palmer's death became not just a personal tragedy, but also a harbinger of a large-scale crisis for the entire family, and for Chicago as a whole. Society froze in anticipation. Everyone wondered if Bertha, accustomed to luxury and receptions, could manage the enormous fortune that had fallen to her. It was widely believed that a woman was incapable of running serious business, and that the Palmers' money would soon be squandered. But Bertha proved them wrong. She inherited not only the money, but also her husband's business acumen, and even surpassed him in the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. However, the crisis lay not only in financial risks. Bertha faced the need to rethink the very concept of wealth and legacy. If Potter Palmer built his empire for power and recognition, Bertha saw money as a tool for creating cultural capital, for supporting art and progress. The widow Palmer faced the most severe test: moral responsibility for her husband's legacy. The will had no restrictions, but there was an unspoken request to preserve not only the fortune, but also the Palmer name in history. From that moment on, the goal of her life became not just owning wealth, but transforming it into something greater, an eternal monument. Bertha made a bold decision. She did not sell the stocks and retire. She took the business management into her own hands, proving herself a tough and insightful leader. She reinvested the money into real estate, new technologies, and even agriculture, becoming one of the pioneers of agribusiness in Florida. But most importantly, she continued collecting art. She bought paintings by Impressionists and Post-Impressionists when few people yet appreciated them. She supported young artists, turning her castle into the center of America's cultural life. Bertha rethought the role of the mistress of a luxurious house. If previously it was a place for receptions and displaying wealth, now the castle became open to artists, musicians, writers, and public figures. She turned private property into a public good, understanding that true greatness lies not in the number of rooms or the cost of chandeliers, but in the influence the house exerts on society. And at that moment, a turn occurred in the fate of the castle that determined its further history. The house, which was meant to stand for centuries, became a victim of the changing era and the pragmatism of new generations. The thing is, Bertha's children did not share her passion for art and culture. They grew up in the shadow of the castle, but never absorbed its spirit. They saw in it not a monument to love and ambitions, but simply a huge, inconvenient house that required too much money and attention. After Bertha's death in 1918, her heirs faced a dilemma. On one hand, they owned an invaluable asset, a symbol of bygone luxury. On the other hand, maintaining the castle was becoming increasingly burdensome. Taxes were rising, servants demanded more money, and the fashion for huge private residences was fading into the past. But the main factor that influenced the fate of the castle was the change of generations. The grandchildren of Potter and Bertha Palmer grew up in the era of jazz and skyscrapers. The values of their grandparents, their pursuit of greatness and eternity, were alien to them. They preferred to live in modern apartments with a view of the city, rather than in a gloomy Gothic castle haunted by ghosts of the past. In their eyes, the castle was not a symbol of legacy, but simply real estate that could be profitably sold. February of 1950 turned out to be especially gray and dank in Chicago. The wind from Lake Michigan, which once tested the strength of the walls of the city's most ambitious residents, now carried dust from its destruction throughout the neighborhood. If you had stood on the sidewalk of North Lakeshore Drive back then, you would have heard a sound that rang like a sentence for an entire era. It was not the solemn thunder of cannons or the majestic music of an orchestra. It was the monotonous, dull, and merciless thud of an iron wrecking ball against noble sandstone and granite. The house that Potter Palmer had built as an impregnable fortress for eternity, the house whose walls were meant to outlast civilizations, surrendered without a fight, turning into a pile of construction debris under the indifferent gazes of passers-by. The demolition of the Palmers' castle became, perhaps, the cruelest and most vivid lesson that history taught to the American dream. Brigades of workers dismantled the building with frightening mechanical efficiency. Those very legendary handleless doors, created as a symbol of absolute exclusivity and protection from the outside world, were ripped out by the roots and thrown into the mud. The Florentine mosaic floors, every fragment of which had been laid by Italian masters, and on which Presidents Ulysses Grant and James Garfield had walked, were crushed into fine crumbs under the heavy boots of the demolishers. Crystal chandeliers, which once captured the city's first electric light, lay shattered in the cold wind. This was not just the destruction of a building, it was the public evisceration of memory. But why did this happen? Why did the city allow its main architectural symbol to be destroyed? The answer lies in the cruel irony of capitalism, of which Potter Palmer himself was an apologist. He bought this land in 1882, when it was an unwanted, swampy wasteland, and built a palace on it to raise the prestige of the district. His strategy worked too well. He succeeded so much that by the mid-20th century, the land under his house itself became worth dozens of times more than the architectural masterpiece standing on it. The castle was destroyed by its own success. For the developers of the post-war boom era, this plot was not a historical legacy, but an ideal building site for two faceless but highly profitable residential towers with 700 standard apartments. Economic expediency, to which Palmer had prayed all his life, ultimately devoured his greatest creation. Before the demolition, an auction took place, which the press dubbed the garage sale of the century. It was a spectacle full of tragedy. Personal belongings, furniture, velvet drapes that Bertha Palmer had ordered in Paris were sold for next to nothing to random people. Items that had been witnesses to the heights of American history were carted off to middle-class living rooms, losing their context and meaning. The huge fireplace, in which whole tree trunks had once burned, was dismantled brick by brick. Luxury meant to inspire awe turned into souvenirs. However, if the story ended only with a pile of bricks and forgotten things, it would be just another sad tale of the transience of being. But the Palmers, even after passing into oblivion, managed to make their last, most grandiose strategic maneuver. The physical body of the castle perished, but its soul made a transcendent transition that ensured the Palmers' name the very immortality that Potter had dreamed of. Bertha Palmer, the woman who filled her husband's stone fortress with light and color, left a will that changed America's cultural landscape forever. She donated a colossal part of her collection to the Art Institute of Chicago. Those very paintings, Two Sisters by Renoir, Haystacks by Claude Monet, Ballerinas by Edgar Degas, which conservative critics in the 80s of the 19th century laughed at, calling them smeared paint, today form the core of one of the world's greatest impressionist collections. Ponder this paradox. Walls built from the strongest granite collapsed after 70 years, and fragile canvases stretched on wooden stretchers outlived their owners, outlived the house, outlived wars and crises. When you today walk through the museum halls and freeze before these canvases, you are effectively inside the Palmers' castle. The gallery was physically destroyed, but it was recreated in eternity. Potter Palmer was wrong in choosing the material for immortality. Stone failed him, But Bertha guessed right. Art proved stronger than granite. What they built for their ego disappeared. What they preserved for humanity lives on. This story is frighteningly relevant for us today, in the 21st century. We live in an era of new, digital castles and unprecedented ostentatious consumption. Modern tech magnates build bunkers in New Zealand, launch rockets to Mars, and erect giant campus fortresses of glass and concrete, trying, just like Palmer, to buy themselves a ticket to eternity, to protect themselves from the world's chaos with high walls of technology. We are all obsessed with the idea of leaving a mark. We build careers, accumulate assets, polish our digital image on social networks. But the story of Potter and Bertha whispers to us through the decades with the cold wind from Lake Michigan. Your walls will fall. Your handleless doors will be broken down. Your digital empires can be erased with one button press or a change of technological era. The great sonnet by Percy Shelley, Ozymandias, comes to mind. A traveler sees in the desert the ruins of a colossal statue, on whose pedestal is written, "Look upon my